Hello, everyone. Welcome to This Week at Work, the show where we bring you the latest trending news on all things HR, technology, and the future of work. This week, I'm actually flying solo. Chris is coming back from a well-deserved family vacation, taking a couple extra days, but we'll have him back on the next show. And I'll be honest, I'm a little bit feeling bad for Chris because this week we have a really exciting topic, something that's been banging around our group chat now for the better part of a few days. And the subject is fake job applicants. As if we didn't need one more thing to worry about with the pandemic and the global recession and all the other social unrest, we now have to think about fake job applicants. So, what does that exactly mean? Well, at the end of June, the FBI, the US based investigation organization, put out a notice to the public, including employers, to keep an eye out for what they characterize as a significant increase in what they call deep fakes. These are job applicants that have bad intentions and that are applying on jobs with false information or under false pretenses, or in some cases, obscuring information like their cameras during video interviews or falsifying information on job applications with the express purpose of gaining entry into organizations with that purpose to get information, logins, passwords, intellectual property, which of course is a significant risk for every organization, especially now in today's digital world. And it would seem like this particular phenomenon or latest trend, as it were, is capitalizing on this interim period of time where organizations are still trying to figure out what exactly to do in this new future of work. A future that in some cases may not involve us ever meeting face to face. We may have employees and collaborators and team members that we just meet digitally. And so it would be easy to understand how people could make a mistake and potentially hire the wrong kind of people and then eventually give them access to passwords and logins and file folders and systems and financials and employee information and customer information. And from there, we all know how fast things can spread digitally. So I think it's a really interesting piece. I mean, it's clearly significant enough that the FBI took the step to put it publicly. They wouldn't do that if it wasn't a significant impetus for it. So, Bruno, when I'm thinking about situations like this, I mean, first I think, like, again, like, could we handle one more thing? And then I also wonder, how are organizations going to respond to things like this? So, as we go through today's conversation, really welcome those who are joining us live to jump in and provide questions or simply answer those questions. The first one being, how should organizations respond to this latest information? Is it a situation where we can, feel confident in our existing practices around hiring and pre-screening and reference checking, that we feel good about hiring the right people, and this is therefore a good reminder, but we feel good about it? Or is it the impetus for change? Is it the opportunity for us to examine our processes and ask us if we should be focusing in on tighter protocols with hiring managers, better record keeping in our ATS platforms, and then ultimately sound reference checking and background checking where that makes sense? So I think that's an interesting question for many organizations. Secondly, I think for the leaders in those organizations, if I'm a hiring manager who's traditionally used to connecting with applicants face to face, so sitting across the table from somebody and having a conversation about who they are and their background and their experiences and their hopes and their dreams and their career aspirations, and then I extend a job offer, I feel very confident that I have a good sense of who that individual is. Now, take the same situation where I'm hiring for a critical role. Maybe I'm feeling the pressure and the urgency to fill this vacancy because I'm taking on some of their responsibilities, or they're accountable for a significant organizational project. And the candidates that I'm meeting now are digital. They're all happening over Zoom. They're all happening over video. And in one case, we have somebody who says, "Hey, Matt, today I can't go on camera. I'm not available to be on camera for whatever reason." And then we have another interview, and the same situation happens again. I'm no longer able to be on camera because now I have a Wi-Fi bandwidth issue, and we don't have the opportunity to validate someone's identity. We don't have the opportunity to authenticate these pieces, and it exposes far greater risk when we don't have that feedback loop of I hired this person, I see them 5 days a week in the office, versus I've hired this person, I don't necessarily know who they are really, and anybody could be logging on behalf of them undertaking activities. Now, I had a chance to connect offline, Bruno, with a couple of folks who were in cybersecurity. So this is not only an HR issue, this is also a broader cybersecurity question. And of course, my colleagues in cybersecurity are seeing record questions and inquiries and concerns as organizations become more digitally native. And what I'm hearing from those folks is to not overreact, that we have good hygiene and protocols in place in most organizations around things like hiring, and we have in most cases good cybersecurity protocols in place. So we shouldn't necessarily overreact to bulletins or memos like this. At the same time, we have to be mindful of there's also a risk of some of these activities if somebody's actually in the office. So before we jump to demonize people because they're working remotely or hybrid and think of this as a new problem, what's new is that people are targeting this medium specifically because it's a digital interface. But the idea of people misappropriating information inside the four walls of an organization, breaking confidentiality, borrowing or taking intellectual property, this isn't new. This happened back as far as pre-digital, and people were taking things out of filing folders and photocopying them. And we just wanted to make sure that in this case that we are taking all the right steps to ensure that our processes are completely aligned with a best practice that mitigates the risk of this likely happening. Now, for the vast majority of organizations, this is likely not going to be a concern. You are not going to generate enough attention or interest from bad parties who are looking to infiltrate your organization under false pretenses. The vast majority of cases, we're looking at individuals that are targeting more sensitive infrastructure, and in particular, specific roles. So when we went through and had conversations with my friends in cybersecurity, they made the point of pointing out that we should be looking at full stack developer roles, data scientist roles, project management roles, folks that are in finance or accounting. Think about the individuals that have the greatest amount of access to sensitive and confidential information. This is where we should likely start as we're considering which roles could be most impacted by something like this. But secondly, looking at roles where there's leadership involved as well, where we may have individuals who have access to multiple sources of information and therefore can find out customer information, financial information, and employee information. So those are some of the more sensitive hotspots. But Bruno, as I want to point out, I love your thoughts on this. How would you advise organizations on trying to find the right balance between reacting and overreacting?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because you have such kind of. I was reading an article on this, and it was the kind of the things that companies can do are so, like, you can check if there's glare in the window behind someone in a job interview, and it's sort of the parameters, then the borders lines are so thin, and so it's obviously kind of something that's quite precarious. It has to be, it's ground that has to be tread on carefully.
Well, I don't mean to laugh because I think the story is funny. I laugh because it reminds me of 20 years in the corporate world and speaking with leaders and organizations that, in my opinion, in some cases may have overreacted to smaller issues. So to me, this feels like a case of let's double check what's going on in the organization. Let's validate that the SOPs that we have in place are functioning, that we have a good level of understanding. This might be a good impetus for us to send a memo out to our organization, our hiring managers, our HR team, to remind them of the importance of things like having cameras on during job interviews, making sure we validate references and do full background checks. It's a call to action in that sense, but I wouldn't necessarily look at overhauling our practice unless we truly have a very informal and therefore leaky process as it pertains to hiring.
Yeah. What do you
this
think?
Is very Go ahead.
What do you think HR's role in this is then?
See, that's the tough part for me, is I think about HR's role, Bruno, and it's a great question. I think the obligation for HR is they are the gatekeepers of this process in most organizations, and therefore they need to be the ones accountable for validating its efficacy. So they need to be taking a leading role on this. I also think that this is a good opportunity for HR to engage with your IT department if you have one in your organization, or a consultant if you don't have one in your organization, that can provide some perspective on best practices around cybersecurity and validate that they have also had a lens on your current ways of working, and that they, if you will, give it a thumbs up or can recommend any additional steps that you can take to further insulate your process from bad actors. So I think that that's a really good step. It's a good opportunity to build that cross-functional partnership. I also think, Bruno, it's an opportunity for us to not overreact. I alluded to this earlier. I think it's really, really important that we don't all run around completely directionless, just taking action. We need to be sensitive to the fact that any actions that we take will have implications within our broader organization. They will have implications to hiring managers, to employees themselves, of course, to HR we just talked about. But we need to be sensitive to the fact that we can't overreact to warnings. Warnings are just that. They are advisements. They're giving us transparency and visibility to things that could happen. And as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of cases, organizations do have programs in place to insulate against this. That being said, you may choose, because of the nature of your organization and the sensitivity of the information or the industry that you're in, to further insulate yourself from that risk. The other question I have, Bruno, I think, which is obvious here, is how should hiring managers show up differently? So yeah, HR, of course, has their responsibility. Organizations have a broader responsibility around architecture and cybersecurity. But as an individual hiring manager who may not be in HR or IT, what is their responsibility in terms of acting on this information? So I think, quick answer, on the assumption that the organization has put out the aforementioned memo that I talked about and has strong SOPs and programs in place, I think it's incumbent upon hiring managers to spend a couple of minutes before their next job interview just to assure that they feel confident in the process, that they feel comfortable that all the steps are being followed. And if in the past they've been loose about things like cameras or job interviews, doing proper background checks and reference checks, this is the time to turn a new page and move forward in a bit more of a compliant, process-oriented way, because I think that ultimately is the salvation here. My concern is that if organizations don't take this seriously, what I've seen in the past is, if there is an example, so let's say, Bruno, in the future, we do hire an individual, and let's just say, for example, that it's not even anything that's nefarious. We just hire somebody who applies for a job, but the person who did the interview isn't the person we actually hired. Let's make this really relatable. So I think in terms of like FBI, Department of Homeland Security, like let's not talk about terrorists and corporate espionage. Let's talk about the vast majority of cases being people who are applying on jobs who aren't the people who are actually taking the jobs. Mm-hmm. So let's say that happens. Let's say someone applies for a job, cameras off, they do the interview, you think, wow, this person's amazing, but the person who actually takes the job is a completely different person. In that case, an organization might be embarrassed having made that mistake, and they might overreact to that single transgression and then put in place much more rigid protocols to offset the likelihood of that happening again. They might ask for multiple levels of authentication. They might ask for more detailed and thorough background and reference checking. They may require individuals to undertake multiple activities to authenticate their identity. My caution would be is right now is not the time to add friction into your hiring process. In the majority of jurisdictions in which my organization operates, Bento HR, and in the vast majority of cases that I talk with senior HR and senior business leaders, there's a real war for talent right now. It is a hot job market despite the cooling economy. And there's a real sense of scarcity around key and talented people in the market. And if you're introducing extra layers of protocol and security, albeit for very justifiable and good reasons, if you're adding steps and days and conversations and friction to your process, you might actually find yourself in a worse off position, more solid from a security perspective, but less attractive from a hiring perspective. So I think HR needs to be mindful of that, but hiring managers need to be mindful of that as well, as trying to find that balance again between security and a great hiring experience.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a question from Dan Baglow, or more a comment, saying, brilliant topic to be alerted to. Happy to be able to join the discussion live. We're very, very glad to have you on here, Dan. He asks, comments, social engineering mixed with the nuances of technology. Having a simple awareness of this risk is a great first line of defense. I'm typically against the formal reference check for most roles, but I'm very open to criminal/education/financial checks as part of the hiring process for all. I think a bad actor could theoretically bypass all of these checks still as they are done today. Adding in skills tests or competency-based questions, which can help spotlight a lie acting versus experience, may be an easy and low-impact adjustment.
Agreed. Always appreciate Dan's contributions to the show and just offline as well. I think Dan raises a really good issue, which is we can add layers and layers and layers and layers of security. And still, if somebody's intent upon getting around security, then they can take a number of steps to thwart our efforts to mitigate against that. And we have to be mindful about, for the vast majority of our organizations, with a very basic level of pre-screening and authentication of identity, we're going to be okay. If I was working in the government or in the military or in a technology firm where the IP is much more valuable to us, I might have a bit more concern around things like that. Financial services, of course, will have much more concern. In the insurance industry, highly regulated industries are going to have a bit more of a stake in this game. But if you're hiring, for example, a part-time hourly paid retail employee, different conversation. If you're hiring somebody in the food and restaurant industry, likely a different conversation. So I think we be mindful of the nuance of where we are. But to Dan's point, we could create a situation where we do full background checks, full reference checks, full credit and financial checks, full competency assessments, face-to-face interviews. All these things are possible, and we could still find that the person is not being fully authentic. They're either overstating previous experiences, they have a headphone in their ear, and they're being fed answers to questions on competency assessments. Like, there's so many different ways people can get around things. I think it's putting the energy in the wrong area, which is why we have to find the balance. This is why this is such an interesting conversation, interesting topic. It's because the initial gut instinct is, okay, the FBI's put out a memo, we should react, we should jump on this, we should take action. We feel good if we take action. And sometimes taking action means taking a step back and asking ourselves, what is the right decision in this case? And I think, Bruno, whether you look at this from an individual hiring manager perspective, from an HR perspective, or from a broader organizational perspective, I think taking those couple of minutes just to ask ourselves, do we have this right? And if not, should we take any action? Is the best first step, as opposed to jumping to overreact to something that could ultimately impact our broader talent and therefore organizational strategy. So I think, Bruno, today's been a great conversation. I didn't even miss Chris for a second. You?
No, neither. Who needs him?
Well, hopefully he's back when he joins us for our next show. But it's been a real pleasure talking today to you folks about the blend again between cybersecurity and talent acquisition and HR and organizations and the future of work. It's a fascinating space that we're in right now, and this topic will surely evolve in the coming weeks and months. That's been This Week at Work. On behalf of myself and Chris Rainey, who's on vacation, I want to thank you for joining us this week. You can join us every Friday at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and 3 p.m. for our folks in the GMT time zone. Well, we do this. We talk about the future of work, technology, HR, all fun things that we've been discussing here on the show. Hope we see you guys again on our next episode. Take care, and we'll talk soon.
Bye.
Yeah.